The echo of Hierapolis. Listen, can you hear it? The sound of water falling over stone, warm and mineral-rich, carrying whispers from deep within the earth. Steam rises in gentle clouds, catching the last golden light of evening as it drifts across terraced pools carved by time itself. This is Hierapolis, the sacred city, where healing waters have drawn pilgrims for over 2,000 years. Tonight we walk these ancient pathways together. We breathe in air thick with mystery and memory, because it was here, in this place where earth meets heaven through curtains of mist, that one of history's most remarkable teachers first drew breath. A man who would show the world that true freedom has nothing to do with the chains we can see, and everything to do with the ones we cannot. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the warm stone beneath your feet. The Romans called this place Hierapolis, the holy city, and you can sense why. Everything here speaks of transformation, water that bubbles up from hidden depths, carrying minerals that build terraces of impossible beauty, pools that reflect not just the sky above, but something deeper, something that seems to whisper of possibilities we've forgotten how to hear. The air carries scents of sulfur and sage, of distant cooking fires and the green smell of gardens tended with ancient care. Merchants' voices drift from the agora, mixing Greek and Latin and a dozen other tongues. Children splash in the sacred pools while their mothers exchange stories in the cooling evening air. This is a crossroads, a place where cultures blend like streams, flowing together into something larger than themselves. But there's something else here too, something harder to name. Walk with me along these marble streets, past columns that catch and hold the dying light. See how the shadows gather in doorways where slaves hurry past, heads down, carrying the weight of other people's lives on their shoulders. Notice how even in this place of healing waters and sacred ground, there are those who move through the world as if they belong to everyone but themselves. It was into this world of beauty and contradiction that our teacher was born, sometime around the year 50, when Nero's Rome was reaching toward its greatest power and its deepest shadows. His parents, we don't know their names. History has a way of forgetting the stories it deems unimportant, but we know they were slaves. We know that their child entered this world already marked by empire as property, as a thing to be owned rather than a soul to be honored. Imagine his mother, perhaps, walking these very terraces in the months before his birth, her hands resting on the curve of her belly as she watches the sun set behind the sacred pools. Does she wonder what kind of world awaits this child? Does she whisper prayers to gods whose names she's forbidden to speak aloud? Or does she simply breathe in the mineral-rich air and trust that somehow, some way, love will be enough? The baby who would become known as Epictetus, though that wasn't his name then, that was just a word that meant acquired, as if a human soul could be purchased like grain or pottery or fine cloth. But names, as he would later teach, are just sounds we make with our mouths. They have no power over the truth of who we are. Picture him as a small child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. His days begin before dawn, as all slave children's days do. But Hierapolis is different from other places. Here, the very ground seems to pulse with something alive. Hot springs bubble up through marble floors. Steam rises from pools that reflect columns and sky in perfect stillness. Even a child born into bondage can sense that this place holds secrets, mysteries that have nothing to do with who owns whom. Maybe he plays by the sacred pools when his work is done. Maybe he listens to the pilgrims who come seeking healing, their voices carrying stories from every corner of the empire. Merchants from Alexandria speak of libraries filled with more scrolls than stars. Soldiers from Gaul describe forests so deep and green they seem to hold their own weather. Philosophers from Athens debate questions that have no easy answers. Questions about what makes a life worth living. And perhaps, even then, something stirs in this small boy's chest, a recognition, a knowing, that the most important journeys happen not across miles of road and sea, but across the infinite landscape of the human heart. The empire that surrounds him is vast beyond imagining. Roman roads stretch like veins across the known world, carrying armies and merchants and ideas, from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the borders of Persia. In Rome itself, emperors live in palaces of impossible luxury, while gladiators die for entertainment in arenas that echo with the roar of crowds. It's a world of extremes, of power and powerlessness, of marble and blood, of triumph and tragedy playing out on a stage so grand it seems to dwarf individual human lives. But here's what that small boy will grow up to understand, in a way that will change not just his own life, but the lives of countless others across centuries. The true battles of human existence are not fought in those grand arenas. They're not won or lost in the palaces of emperors or the campaigns of generals. They happen in the quiet moments when we choose how to respond to what life brings us. They happen in the space between what happens to us and what we make it mean. The Roman Empire believes it can own people. It believes that power comes from controlling others, from building walls and armies and systems of dominance that stretch across continents. But there's a different kind of power, one that no empire can touch, the power that lives in the choosing, the power that rests in that sacred space between stimulus and response, between what the world does to us and what we decide to do with it. As evening deepens over Hierapolis, the sacred pools begin to glow with their own inner light. Minerals in the water catch and hold the last rays of sun, creating pools of liquid gold that seem to pulse with heartbeats older than memory. Steam rises like prayers made visible, carrying the hopes and fears of all who have ever come here, seeking something they couldn't name. And in this moment, in this place where Earth's hidden fires meet the cooling air of evening, we begin to sense the profound truth that this slave child will spend his life discovering and sharing. That freedom, real freedom, has nothing to do with the circumstances that surround us. It has everything to do with how we choose to meet those circumstances, with the stories we tell ourselves about what our lives mean, with the quiet, revolutionary act of deciding that our souls belong to us, no matter what anyone else might claim to own. This is where it all begins, in a holy city built around waters that transform stone into beauty, in the heart of an empire that believes it can possess human souls, in the life of a child who will grow up to show the world that the most powerful force in human existence is not the ability to control others, but the courage to govern ourselves. The merchants are closing their stalls now. Families gather around evening fires. The sacred pools reflect stars that are just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. And somewhere in this ancient city, a story is beginning. A story about what it means to be truly free. A story that will echo across centuries, reaching even here, even now, even to you as you rest in the quiet sanctuary of your own evening. Because the questions that mattered in Hierapolis 2,000 years ago, they matter still. In a world that often feels like it's spinning too fast, that demands too much, that asks us to be everything to everyone while somehow remaining true to ourselves. These ancient wisdoms offer something precious. They offer a way home, not to a place, but to a way of being, not to a different set of circumstances, but to a different way of dancing with whatever circumstances we find. The echo of Hierapolis calls to us still, in the sound of water over stone, in the rising mist of evening, in the eternal question of what it means to live a life that belongs fully, completely, courageously to ourselves. And so our journey begins. Our chains and choices in Rome, from the sacred pools of Hierapolis to the marble streets of Rome, a journey measured not in miles, but in the transformation of a soul. Picture, if you will, the Rome of the 1st century, the eternal city at the height of its power, streets that pulse with the rhythm of empire, the forum bustling with senators in white togas, their voices echoing off ancient stones as they debate the fate of nations, the Circus Maximus roaring with the cheers of 250,000 spectators, aqueducts carrying fresh mountain water across impossible distances, a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. This is the Rome of marble and gold, of triumph and spectacle. But there is another Rome, too, a Rome of shadows and service, a Rome where human beings are bought and sold like grain or olive oil, where a child from Hierapolis might find himself swept up in the great machine of empire, not as a citizen, but as property. It is here, in this city of contradictions, that our young philosopher begins to understand the most profound lesson of his life, the difference between what can be controlled and what cannot. Epictetus arrives in Rome as he arrived in this world, without choice in the matter. He belongs now to a man named Epaphroditus. Even the name tells a story. Epaphroditus, meaning lovely or charming in Greek. How strange that a man who deals in human flesh should carry such a name. But then, Rome is full of such contradictions. Epaphroditus is no ordinary slave owner. He serves in the household of Nero himself, moving through the corridors of imperial power with the careful step of one who knows that favor and disgrace are separated by the thinnest of margins. He is educated, cultured, a man who appreciates philosophy and rhetoric. Perhaps this is why he allows his young slave to attend lectures, or perhaps he simply sees potential profit in an educated servant. The boy who will become Epictetus walks these Roman streets with a limp. Some say from birth, others whisper of a cruel master's discipline. The truth is lost to time, but the limp remains, a visible reminder of the body's vulnerability, its susceptibility to forces beyond our control. But watch him carefully as he moves through this world of marble and shadow. Notice how he carries himself. There is something in his bearing, something in the way he observes the bustling life around him, that speaks of an inner landscape far vaster than the physical boundaries that contain him. In the morning, he might be found copying documents in Epaphroditus's study, his careful script recording the mundane details of imperial bureaucracy. His hands belong to another. His time is not his own. His very body can be commanded at will. And yet there is something that remains untouched, something that no chain can bind, no master can command. The streets of Rome become his classroom, every interaction a lesson in human nature. He watches the senators hurrying to their appointments, faces tight with worry about votes and alliances. He observes the wealthy matrons shopping in the markets, their satisfaction so dependent on having more, better, newer than their neighbors. He sees the gladiators being led to the arena, some trembling with fear, others walking with a strange peace, having already accepted what cannot be changed. And slowly, gradually, a revolutionary idea begins to take shape in his mind. What if freedom has nothing to do with where you can go or what you can do? What if it has everything to do with how you think about where you are and what is happening to you? This is dangerous thinking for a slave, but it is also liberating thinking for anyone who has ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. In the evenings, when his duties are done, Epictetus makes his way to the lecture halls where stoic philosophers gather. Here, in rooms thick with the smoke of oil lamps and the weight of ancient wisdom, he encounters the teachings that will shape his understanding of what it means to be truly human. The Stoics speak of a universe governed by reason, a cosmic order in which everything has its place and purpose. They teach that happiness comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you get, or rather, from understanding so deeply the difference between what you can and cannot control that the question of wanting becomes irrelevant. For most of the students in these halls, these are intellectual exercises, interesting ideas to debate over wine and dinner. But for Epictetus, they are matters of survival. When you own nothing, not even yourself, you must find your wealth elsewhere. When you can go nowhere by choice, you must discover the vast territories of the inner life. He begins to see that his fellow slaves fall into different categories. Some rage against their circumstances, spending their energy in futile rebellion against unchangeable facts. Others sink into despair, allowing their external bondage to become internal defeat. But a few, a precious few, find a third way. These are the ones who discover that while their bodies can be commanded, their thoughts remain their own. While their actions can be dictated, their responses to those actions belong to them alone. While their circumstances can be controlled by others, their relationship to those circumstances is theirs to determine. This is not passive acceptance. This is not the resignation of the defeated. This is something far more radical. The recognition that true power lies not in controlling the world around us, but in mastering the world within us. As the months pass in Epaphroditus' household, Epictetus begins to embody this philosophy in ways both small and profound. When commanded to perform a task, he does so without the inner rebellion that poisons so many of his fellow servants. When treated unjustly, he responds with a calm that puzzles his tormentors. When praised for his intelligence or diligence, he receives the praise without letting it inflate his sense of self-worth. He is learning day by day, hour by hour, the most difficult lesson any human being can master. How to be fully present in circumstances you would not have chosen. How to find meaning in situations that seem meaningless. How to maintain your essential dignity when the world treats you as disposable. The other servants begin to notice something different about him. There is a stillness in his presence, a quality of attention that makes others feel heard and seen. When they come to him with their troubles, and they do come, drawn by something they cannot quite name, he listens with the whole of himself. He does not offer easy comfort or false promises. He does not pretend that their suffering is not real or that their circumstances are not difficult. Instead, he helps them discover what he himself is learning, that even in the most constrained circumstances, there are always choices to be made. Small choices, perhaps invisible to others, but choices nonetheless. The choice of how to hold your shoulders when walking across the courtyard. The choice of what thoughts to entertain when lying on your sleeping mat. The choice of whether to let bitterness take root in your heart or to plant something else there instead. These may seem like small things, but Epictetus is beginning to understand that freedom is built from such small things, that dignity is constructed from tiny moments of choosing well, that a life worth living can be lived anywhere, under any circumstances, by anyone willing to take responsibility for their inner world. And so, in the heart of the empire that enslaves him, a young man begins to discover what it truly means to be free. The Secretary's Study. The study of Epaphroditus exists in a world of whispered power, where the scratching of reed pens carries the weight of imperial decree. Here, beneath coffered ceilings painted with scenes of conquest, the business of empire unfolds in measured tones and careful calculations. It is morning when Epictetus enters this sanctuary of influence, carrying a tray of heated wine and honey cakes still warm from the kitchen ovens. The air holds the mingled scents of beeswax candles, aged papyrus, and the faint trace of expensive incense that seems to cling to everything Epaphroditus touches. Sunlight filters through high windows, casting geometric patterns across marble floors worn smooth by the footsteps of senators and freedmen alike. Epaphroditus sits behind a desk of polished cedar, its surface covered with the instruments of power. Bronze styluses, ivory tablets, scrolls sealed with the personal marks of men who shape the known world. His fingers, soft from a life spent handling documents rather than tools, move with practiced precision as he sorts through the morning's correspondence. "The senator's request regarding the grain shipments," he murmurs, not looking up as Epictetus arranges the refreshments on a side table. "And this matter of the aqueduct repairs. The emperor will want numbers, not excuses." Epictetus moves quietly, efficiently, but his eyes are learning to see beyond the surface of things. Where others might observe only the trappings of authority, he begins to notice something else entirely. The way Epaphroditus's jaw tightens when certain names are mentioned, the careful modulation of his voice when speaking of imperial displeasure, the slight tremor in his hands when a message arrives bearing the wrong seal. Power, Epictetus realizes, is its own form of slavery. His master may command dozens of subordinates, may influence the flow of grain to distant provinces, may walk the corridors of the palace with apparent confidence. But watch him closely, and you see a man in constant fear. Fear of falling from favor, fear of making the wrong recommendation, fear of the very emperor he serves with such elaborate devotion. The morning progresses in its familiar rhythm. Scribes arrive with reports from across the empire, accounts of harvests in Egypt, shipping delays in Gaul, unrest among the Germanic tribes. Each piece of information must be weighed, categorized, transformed into the kind of summary that will satisfy imperial curiosity without triggering imperial wrath. Epictetus refills wine cups and tends the brazier, but part of his attention drifts to the conversations flowing around him. He hears the language of compromise, the careful dance of men who must appear decisive while avoiding any decision that might later be questioned. He watches as his master transforms complex realities into simple assurances, knowing that truth itself must be shaped to fit the expectations of absolute power. And slowly, quietly, a different kind of understanding begins to take root in the young slave's mind. What if true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering oneself? What if real freedom comes not from commanding external circumstances, but from choosing how to respond to whatever circumstances arise? These thoughts surface during the long afternoon hours, when the study grows warm and drowsy, and the steady scratch of pens creates a rhythm like rainfall. Epictetus arranges scrolls and cleans ink stains from marble surfaces, but his mind wanders to the stoic teachings he has been absorbing, fragments of wisdom that seem to illuminate everything around him with startling clarity. He observes how his master's mood shifts with each message received, how external events seem to pull Epaphroditus this way and that like a ship without anchor. A favorable report from Spain brings momentary satisfaction. News of delays in Britain triggers immediate anxiety. A summons to the palace sends him into careful preparation that borders on panic. But what if? What if it were possible to remain steady, regardless of the news? What if inner peace could be maintained even in the face of uncertainty, disappointment, even genuine danger? The idea feels revolutionary, almost dangerous in its simplicity. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows grow long and the study takes on the golden quality of approaching evening, a particular messenger arrives. Epictetus recognizes the man's bearing immediately. The rigid posture, the ceremonial insignia, the way even Epaphroditus straightens involuntarily at his entrance. The emperor wishes to review the provincial assessments, the messenger announces, his voice carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. Tonight, before the evening meal. Epictetus watches his master's face carefully, sees the flash of panic quickly suppressed, the mental calculations already beginning. Which reports are ready? Which might require adjustment? How much time to prepare responses to questions that cannot be predicted? Of course, Epaphroditus replies smoothly. Everything will be in order. but his hands betray him, trembling slightly as he reaches for the relevant documents. The messenger departs, and immediately the study transforms into controlled chaos. Scribes are summoned. Documents are reviewed with desperate attention to detail. Epictetus finds himself moving quickly between tasks, preparing fresh ink, lighting additional lamps, ensuring that every surface gleams with the kind of perfection that might deflect imperial criticism. And through it all, he continues to observe, continues to learn. He sees how external demands create internal turmoil, how the approval of others becomes a kind of prison, how even the most powerful men can be reduced to anxiety by forces beyond their control. But he also begins to glimpse an alternative, a way of being that might remain untouched by such turbulence. What if your worth didn't depend on another's approval? What if your peace of mind couldn't be disturbed by circumstances you cannot change? What if freedom meant something entirely different from what the world believes it to mean? As evening approaches and Epaphroditus prepares for his audience with the emperor, Epictetus tends to the final details of the study, banking the fires, organizing the scattered papers, preparing the space for tomorrow's continuation of the same eternal dance between power and fear. The oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls, and for a moment the young slave pauses in his work. Around him lie all the instruments of worldly influence, the seals and signatures, the reports and recommendations, the careful documentation of an empire's daily business. But something else lives in this room now, something invisible yet more substantial than all the marble and bronze. An idea is taking shape, a philosophy being born from careful observation and quiet reflection. The understanding that true strength might be found not in commanding others, but in governing oneself. That real freedom might exist not in the absence of constraints, but in choosing how to respond to whatever constraints exist. In the heart of imperial power, surrounded by all the trappings of worldly authority, a slave is discovering something that no emperor can grant and no master can take away. He is learning what it means to be truly free. Echoes of the Forum. The morning air in Rome carries 1,000 stories. The clatter of wooden wheels on stone, the calls of merchants hawking their wares, the shuffle of countless feet making their way through the labyrinth of streets that spread like veins from the heart of the empire. For most who walk these streets, the city is a stage, a place to see and be seen, to climb or fall, to grasp for more, or lose what little they have. But for one quiet figure moving through the crowds, Rome has become something else entirely, a classroom. A place where every interaction, every overheard conversation, every glimpse of human nature offers another lesson in the art of living. Epictetus moves through the marketplace with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to find his place in any crowd, not pushing forward with the urgency of ambition, not shrinking back with the fear of the powerless, simply present, aware, watching the great theater of human desire play out around him. Here, in the Forum Boreum, where cattle once were traded and now goods from across the empire change hands, he observes something fascinating, the same patterns repeating endlessly. The merchant who haggles fiercely over the price of olive oil, his face flushed with the effort of winning. The wealthy matron who examines silk with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The young senator's son who purchases exotic spices not for their flavor, but for what owning them says about his status. All of them. Searching. Striving. Convinced that the next acquisition, the next victory, the next external change will finally bring them what they seek. And what do they seek? The same thing every human heart has always sought: peace, contentment, a sense that they are enough, that they have enough, that life is enough, Watching them, Epictetus feels something that might surprise those who know his circumstances. Not pity, but a kind of gentle compassion, because he recognizes in their frantic searching the same impulse that once drove him to despair over his own situation. The belief that happiness must be seized from the outside world, that freedom must be granted by others, that peace is something to be purchased or won. He pauses by a fountain, its water catching the morning light. Around him, the city pulses with its relentless energy. But here, in this small pocket of stillness, he finds himself reflecting on a curious paradox. His life, by any external measure, could hardly be simpler. He owns nothing beyond the basic tunic on his back and the simple sandals on his feet. His meals are whatever is provided in his master's household: plain bread, olives, perhaps some cheese or fish. His sleeping quarters are a small room with a narrow bed and little else. By the standards of those rushing past him in the marketplace, he should be miserable, envious, desperate to change his circumstances. And yet, there is something liberating about having so little to lose, something clarifying about being stripped of the endless choices that seem to torment those with greater means. When you cannot control what you eat, you learn to find satisfaction in whatever nourishes you. When you cannot choose where you live, you learn to make any space feel like home. When you cannot determine your daily schedule, you learn to find freedom in how you meet whatever the day brings. This is not the resignation of defeat. It is something far more radical. It is the discovery that contentment, true contentment, has very little to do with external circumstances. He thinks of Epictetus with his vast household and his rooms full of beautiful objects. His master has access to the finest foods, the most comfortable furnishings, the most exquisite entertainment the empire can provide. And yet, how often does he seem truly at peace? How frequently does Epictetus observe him fretting over some slight from a colleague, or anxious about some shift in imperial favor, or dissatisfied with some aspect of his abundant life? The man who can have almost anything he desires constantly. The man who can control so much of his external world is controlled by his need to control it. Meanwhile, the slave who can control almost nothing external is discovering an inner territory where he is absolutely sovereign. A commotion draws his attention. A young man, clearly from a wealthy family, judging by his fine toga, and the slaves attending him, is arguing loudly with a vendor. The price of some decorative pottery, it seems, is not to his liking. His voice rises. His gestures become more dramatic. Other shoppers turn to watch the spectacle. "Do you know who I am?" the young man demands. "Do you know what my father could do to your miserable business?" The vendor, an older man with calloused hands and patient eyes, simply nods and begins to wrap up his wares. He has seen this performance before. He knows it will pass. Watching this small drama unfold, Epictetus feels a familiar stirring of insight. Here, in miniature, is the great human tragedy. A young man with every external advantage, education, wealth, status, opportunity, made miserable by his attachment to getting his way in a matter of a few coins. His happiness held hostage by the actions of a pottery seller he will likely never see again. The vendor, meanwhile, accepts the situation with a kind of dignified grace. He cannot control whether this customer buys from him or not. He cannot control the young man's anger or his threats, but he can control his own response. He can choose to remain calm, to preserve his dignity, to focus on what actually matters: his craft, his family, his own sense of honor. As the crowd disperses and the drama fades, Epictetus finds himself smiling slightly, not at anyone's expense, but at the clarity of the lesson, the profound teaching hidden in this ordinary moment. The young aristocrat, for all his privileges, is enslaved by his expectations. The humble vendor, for all his limitations, is free in his acceptance. This is the revolution that is slowly taking root in Epictetus's understanding. Freedom is not about having more choices. It is about making better choices with whatever options exist. Peace is not about getting what you want. It is about wanting what you have, or at least accepting it fully. Strength is not about controlling others. It is about governing yourself. The sun climbs higher, and the marketplace grows busier. Soon, duty will call him back to his master's house, to whatever tasks await him there. But for now, in this moment of quiet observation, he feels something approaching gratitude. Gratitude for these lessons that his circumstances have made possible, for the clarity that comes from having nowhere to hide from life's essential questions, for the discovery that happiness, real happiness, might be simpler than anyone imagines. Not simple to achieve, perhaps, but simple in its requirements. Just this: to accept what cannot be changed, to change what can be changed, and to find the wisdom to know the difference. Just this: to remember that you are not your circumstances, but how you choose to meet them. Just this: to understand that the only prison that truly confines you is the one you build with your own expectations, fears, and desires. And perhaps most importantly, to realize that the key to that prison has been in your hands all along. The banished philosopher. Years passed in this quiet understanding. Epictetus continued his duties in Epaphroditus' household, but something had shifted within him. He moved through his days with a different quality of presence. Not the resignation of defeat, but the calm confidence of someone who had found an unshakable foundation. He had discovered what the Stoic masters meant when they spoke of the citadel of the self, that inner sanctuary that no emperor could touch, no circumstance could breach. But empires, like all things, are subject to change. In the year 89, whispers began to spread through the corridors of power. Emperor Domitian, grown paranoid and suspicious, had turned his attention to the philosophers. These teachers of virtue and wisdom, he declared, were a threat to the stability of Rome. Their questions bred dissent. Their independence of thought challenged authority. The decree, when it came, was swift and absolute. All philosophers were to be banished from Rome. Epictetus received the news with the same steady calm he had cultivated over decades. While others raged against the injustice, while some pleaded for exceptions, he simply nodded. This too was beyond his control. This too was an opportunity to practice what he had learned. We cannot choose what happens to us, he would later tell his students, but we can always choose how we respond. The preparations for departure were surprisingly simple, a lifetime reduced to what could be carried in a small bundle. But then Epictetus had long understood that the most valuable possessions were the ones that could never be taken away. As he walked through the streets of Rome for the last time, he noticed how differently he saw the city now. The marble columns that had once seemed so permanent now appeared fragile, temporary. The bustling crowds, the merchants hawking their wares, the senators in their togas, all of it part of the great flowing river of change. He paused at the baths of Caracalla, those magnificent structures that represented the pinnacle of Roman engineering and luxury. Steam rose from the heated pools, just as it had from the sacred springs of his birthplace. But here, the steam would one day cease. These baths, like all human creations, would crumble. The marble would crack, the pools would empty, and grass would grow through the ruins. Nothing lasts forever, nothing except the principles we choose to live by. The journey to Nicopolis took weeks. Each step carried him further from the life he had known toward an uncertain future. But uncertainty, he had learned, was simply another word for possibility. Nicopolis, the city of victory, built by Augustus to commemorate his triumph at the Battle of Actium, How fitting that a place named for external conquest should become the site of his greatest internal victories. The city sat on the western coast of Greece, where the Ionian Sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Here, the light had a different quality. Softer, more golden than the harsh brilliance of Rome. The pace of life moved more slowly, more thoughtfully. Epictetus found modest lodgings and began to teach. At first, only a few students came. Word travels slowly in exile, but gradually, as his reputation grew, more arrived. Young men from wealthy families seeking wisdom their privilege couldn't provide, former soldiers looking for peace after years of war, even some women, though they had to listen from the shadows, hungry for teachings that spoke to the universal human experience of suffering and growth. His school was unlike the grand academies of Athens or the exclusive circles of Rome. It was simple, practical, focused not on abstract theories, but on the art of living well, how to face loss without being destroyed, how to find joy that didn't depend on circumstances, how to love without attachment, to care without controlling. Philosophy, he would tell his students, is not about clever arguments or impressive knowledge. It is medicine for the soul. In the evenings, when the day's teaching was done, Epictetus would often walk to a small garden overlooking the sea. It was a modest place. A few olive trees, some herbs, a stone bench worn smooth by weather and time. Nothing like the elaborate gardens of Roman villas, with their manicured perfection and exotic imports. But this garden had something those others lacked. It had acceptance. The plants that grew here were the ones suited to the soil, the climate, the natural conditions. They didn't struggle against their environment. They worked with it, found their own way to flourish within the constraints they were given. Sitting on that weathered bench, watching the sun set over the Ionian Sea, Epictetus would reflect on the strange journey that had brought him here, from slave to teacher, from voiceless property to a voice that would echo through centuries. The irony wasn't lost on him. Domitian's attempt to silence the philosophers had only created new opportunities for their teachings to spread. The emperor, in trying to control thought, had demonstrated its ultimate freedom. You can banish the teacher, but you cannot banish the truth. Sometimes, in the gathering dusk, students would find him there and ask about his past, about Rome, about slavery, about the pain of exile. He would smile and redirect their attention to the present moment. "Why do you look backward?" he would ask gently, "when the path ahead is where your choices matter." This wasn't denial or avoidance. It was the deepest wisdom of acceptance. The past had shaped him, yes, but it did not define him. Each moment offered a fresh opportunity to choose wisdom over resentment, growth over bitterness, love over fear. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, he would often think of the other exiled philosophers scattered across the empire, each finding their own way to continue the work, each proving that ideas, unlike bodies, cannot be imprisoned. The emperor who banished them would be forgotten by history, remembered only as a footnote of tyranny. But the teachings, the simple, profound truths about human dignity and inner freedom, these would outlive empires. In the gentle darkness of that Greek garden, with the sound of waves whispering against the shore, Epictetus embodied the deepest truth of his philosophy. That resilience isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing how to bend without losing your essential shape, how to adapt without abandoning your principles, how to find home not in a place, but in a way of being. A new school, a timeless wisdom. And so, in this place of exile that became home, something remarkable began to unfold. Word spread through the Greek cities, through the trading routes that connected distant lands, that in Nicopolis there was a teacher unlike any other. They came at first in small numbers, young Romans seeking wisdom their wealth couldn't buy, Greek scholars hungry for practical philosophy, former soldiers looking for peace after years of war. They arrived dusty from long journeys, carrying questions that had kept them awake at night. Epictetus would greet them in that simple courtyard, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke. No grand lecture halls, no marble statues or gilded decorations. Just a man who had learned the deepest secrets of human freedom, sharing them beneath the open sky. "What disturbs people," he would tell his students, settling onto a stone bench, worn smooth by countless conversations, "is not things themselves, but the judgments they form about things." The words were simple, revolutionary in their simplicity. A young merchant, anxious about a failed business venture, would suddenly understand that his suffering came not from the loss itself, but from his story about what the loss meant. A woman grieving her husband's death would discover that while her sorrow was natural and sacred, her torment came from fighting against what had already happened, from demanding that reality be different than it was. The school grew organically, like a garden tended with patience and care. Students would arrive planning to stay for weeks and remain for years, not because Epictetus demanded it, but because they found something here they had never encountered before. A way of living that made sense, a philosophy that worked not just in theory, but in the messy, complicated reality of daily life. Arrian, a young Roman historian, began recording the master's teachings. He would sit quietly in the corner, stylus moving across wax tablets, capturing not just the words but the spirit behind them, the gentle humor, the profound compassion, the unwavering commitment to human dignity. "We are all actors in a play," Epictetus would say, his eyes twinkling with that particular mixture of wisdom and mischief. "Assigned our roles by the divine director. Our job isn't to choose our part, but to play it with excellence, whether we're cast as a king or a beggar." The students would laugh, recognizing themselves in this metaphor, how much energy they had wasted fighting their assigned roles, instead of discovering the freedom that came from embracing them fully. In the evenings, as the Mediterranean sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, the conversations would continue, around simple meals shared in fellowship, during walks along paths lined with olive trees, in quiet moments of reflection as the stars emerged. This was education as it was meant to be, not the memorization of facts, but the transformation of hearts, not the accumulation of information, but the cultivation of wisdom. Years passed like seasons, each bringing new students, new insights, new depths of understanding. The school became legendary throughout the Roman world, but Epictetus himself remained unchanged, still the humble teacher who had learned his greatest lessons in chains. He would watch his students prepare to leave, carrying his teachings back to their own cities, their own challenges. Some would become teachers themselves. Others would apply the philosophy in their businesses, their families, their quiet daily struggles. All would carry forward a simple but revolutionary understanding that true power lies not in controlling what happens to you, but in choosing how you respond to what happens to you. The scrolls accumulated in the school's modest library, Arrian's careful records, letters from former students, commentaries and discussions that would preserve these teachings for generations yet unborn. But the real preservation happened in transformed lives, in the merchant who learned to find contentment regardless of profit or loss, in the mother who discovered how to love her children without being consumed by worry for their futures, in the soldier who found peace after witnessing the horrors of war. Each student became a living scroll, carrying forward not just ideas, but a way of being in the world. As Epictetus grew older, his body more frail but his spirit ever more luminous, he would sometimes sit quietly in his garden at twilight, listening to the voices of his students discussing philosophy under the stars, watching the eternal dance of waves against the shore. He had been born a slave in a city of healing waters, had served in the corridors of imperial power, had been exiled to this distant shore. And here, in this place of supposed banishment, he had found his truest calling, not just as a teacher, but as a guardian of something precious and eternal. The knowledge that every human being, regardless of circumstances, carries within themselves the capacity for wisdom, dignity, and inner freedom. Epictetus, the road to acceptance. Years passed like seasons in Nicopolis, and with each turning of time, something remarkable happened. The road that led to the city, the same dusty path that had once carried an exiled philosopher into uncertainty, began to transform in meaning. Students would arrive, travel-worn and seeking. Some came from Athens, others from distant provinces. They walked that road carrying their burdens, their fears about the future, their regrets about the past, their desperate need to control what lay beyond their reach. But as they learned, as they sat in those simple rooms and absorbed the teachings, something shifted. The road that had brought them here became something different on their return journey. It became the road to acceptance. Epictetus would often walk with departing students to the city's edge. His steps, still marked by that old injury from his slave days, had found their own rhythm of peace. "Remember," he would say, watching the path stretch toward distant horizons, "the road itself hasn't changed, but you have learned to walk it differently." This was perhaps his greatest gift to the world, not a complex philosophy requiring years of study, but a simple, revolutionary understanding. We suffer not because of what happens to us, but because of our resistance to what happens to us. The merchant loses his fortune and rages against fate. The mother watches her child choose a different path and fights to control what cannot be controlled. The student fails an examination and drowns in shame about the past. But there is another way. Some things are within our power, Epictetus taught, while others are not. Such simple words, yet they contain the seed of transformation. Within our power are our judgments, our responses, our choices about how to meet each moment. Outside our power, nearly everything else. The weather that ruins our plans, the opinions others hold about us, the aging of our bodies, the changes that sweep through our lives like wind through wheat fields. When we truly understand this distinction, when we stop exhausting ourselves trying to control the uncontrollable, something beautiful happens. We discover energy we never knew we had, peace we thought was impossible. The road to acceptance isn't about becoming passive, it's about becoming powerful. In the only realm where true power exists, the realm of our inner response. A student once asked him, "Master, how do we know when we found this acceptance?" Epictetus smiled, that gentle expression that had replaced the harder look of his younger years. "You'll know," he said, "because you'll stop fighting the road and start walking it with curiosity instead of resistance." In the evening light of Nicopolis, as the Mediterranean caught the last rays of sun, this truth seemed to shimmer in the air itself. Every person who had ever lived had walked some version of this road, the road of human experience, with its unexpected turns and challenging passages. The wise ones, they learned to walk it lightly, not because their roads were easier, but because they carried less. They had set down the weight of demanding that life be different than it was. They had found the road to acceptance and discovered it led not to resignation, but to a deeper, more authentic engagement with the precious, unrepeatable gift of being alive. This was Epictetus's legacy, not carved in marble or written in gold, but walked daily by anyone who chose the path of inner freedom. The stillness within. And so the teachings rippled outward from that hillside school in Nicopolis, like the sacred waters of Hierapolis where his story began, flowing through centuries and across continents, carrying with them the simple, revolutionary truth that freedom lives within. The students who walked those dusty paths became teachers themselves, not through grand proclamations or elaborate philosophies, but through the quiet example of lives lived with greater peace, greater acceptance, greater understanding of what truly matters. They returned to their homes, their work, their families, carrying something invisible yet transformative, the knowledge that beneath all the noise and chaos of daily existence, there exists a place of profound stillness, a sanctuary that no emperor can banish, no circumstance can destroy, no external force can ever truly touch. This is the stillness within, the place Epictetus discovered in his years of slavery and refined in his decades of teaching, the inner citadel where true freedom dwells, waiting patiently for us to remember it exists. It waits for you now, in this quiet moment, as your breathing deepens, as the day's concerns begin to settle, as you allow yourself to simply be without performing, without comparing, without carrying anyone else's expectations or emotions. Like those ancient students walking the moonlit paths around Nicopolis, you too can find this place of peace, this refuge that exists not in changing your circumstances, but in changing your relationship to them, not in controlling what happens, but in choosing how you respond, not in demanding that life be different, but in discovering the profound grace available in accepting what is. The warm springs of Hierapolis still flow just as they did when Epictetus was born into slavery, just as they did when he returned as a free man, just as they flow now, constant, healing, eternal, reminding us that some things endure beyond the temporary turbulence of human affairs. The school at Nicopolis may have crumbled, its stones scattered, its classrooms silent, but the wisdom shared there lives on. In every moment, someone chooses acceptance over resistance, peace over anxiety, inner freedom over external validation, love over fear. You are part of this ancient lineage now, this quiet revolution of the heart, this gentle insurrection against the tyranny of circumstances, this timeless community of souls who have discovered that the kingdom of heaven, the promised land, the place of perfect peace, was never somewhere else, was never in some distant future, but here, now, within, as sleep begins to claim you, as your thoughts grow soft and dreamlike, as your body releases the day's tensions. Remember this truth that Epictetus carried from slavery to freedom, from Rome to Nicopolis, from his time to ours, that you already possess everything you need for peace, for contentment, for the deepest kind of freedom, and it waits for you always in the sacred stillness within, where the waters of acceptance flow eternal, where the lamp of wisdom burns bright, where the school of the heart remains forever open, teaching the only lesson that truly matters, that you are already, perfectly, completely free.